We call him Doubting Thomas, as if one broken moment was enough to rename his whole life. As if one really hard weekend canceled every act of courage that came before it. Because I think we've been unfair to Thomas. Before Thomas ever said, "Unless I see the wounds," he'd already said something most of us would have been really scared to say. In John chapter 11, Lazarus had died, and Jesus says he's going back to Judea. That sounds simple until you remember the disciples knew exactly what was waiting there. Danger, threats, religious leaders who had already tried to stone Jesus. That was not a safe journey. That was not a polite ministry visit. This was walking back into the place where death was certain. And the disciples knew it. They were nervous, they were scared, they were warning Jesus, and they could just feel the risk there. And then Thomas speaks, "Let us also go that we may die with him." That is not weakness, that is not doubt, that is not cowardice. That is not the voice of a man who does not love Jesus. That is loyalty with his eyes open. Thomas was not pretending the danger was not real. He knew it clearly. And he still chose Jesus. He was willing to walk into the fire because he could not bear the thought of Jesus walking into it alone. So when we meet Thomas later after the resurrection and he cannot bring himself to believe straight away, maybe we need to stop flattening the man into some stupid nickname. Maybe his doubt was not arrogance. Maybe it was grief, shock. Maybe it was a heart that had already braced itself to die with Jesus, only to watch Jesus die without him. Think about that. Maybe he was not trying to be difficult. Maybe he was trying not to hope again and be crushed again. And that changes the way you will read him. Because Jesus didn't come to Thomas with disgust. He doesn't humiliate him. He doesn't say, "Oh, after all of this, how dare you?" Jesus comes close. He shows him the scars because he knew Thomas's heart. He meets Thomas in the same place where his faith had frozen. And Thomas doesn't respond with a mild apology. He gives one of the strongest confessions in the Gospels, "My Lord and my God." That does not sound like a faithless man. That sounds like a wounded man finally breathing again. We need to be very careful how quickly we name people by one low moment. One season of doubt doesn't erase a life of devotion. One hard question doesn't mean someone's walked away. One moment of struggling does not mean that they didn't love Jesus. Sometimes messy faith isn't rebellion. Sometimes it's heartbreak. Sometimes the person's asking hard questions not to destroy their faith. They're trying to find a way back to trust after disappointment, grief, and trauma. And we've all done that. We just need to be honest about it. Thomas was not a doubter. He was the one willing to die with Jesus before he knew how the story would end. And history and tradition tells us he kept going further than many, all the way to India, still preaching, still carrying the name of Jesus, still faithful to his death. So maybe, just maybe, we stop calling him Doubter Thomas. Maybe we remember him as loyal Thomas, Thomas the wounded, Thomas the honest, Thomas the one Jesus met with scars, not shame. Because that is good news for the rest of us. Jesus is not afraid of the questions that come from a crushed heart. He doesn't turn away from the believer who needs to see the scars. He comes close enough to say, "Look, touch, I'm still here."